This shock couldn't have come at a more difficult time for Africa. You've got fiscal scarcity, high inflation. How concerned are you at the IMF at what you're seeing?
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to hand my mic to you guys because these things are disappointing us.
Thanks a lot. And first, I would like to thank colleagues from the Afreximbank and the governor and the Bank of Central Bank of Egypt.
Could I ask you to speak up a little bit?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now? All right. So let me first thank the colleagues from the Afreximbank and the governor and his colleagues at the Central Bank of Egypt for inviting me to this distinguished panel and superb event. So you asked a tough question, and there have been great insights that were made by my colleagues, panelists. It's a very difficult period for the region, and I think, as the Professor Kabureka made in his excellent presentation, it's a shock that comes on top of another shock. And let me just take you back a bit. When the region was coming out of the pandemic, it was coming out with a strong momentum in growth. In fact, we were surprised in 2021 by how strong growth was, because we were predicting, for example, when you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we were predicting growth at 3.8%. It came out at 4.5%. But so there was a very strong momentum that built up in the second half of 2021. And what this war has done is to just stop it net. Had we not had this war, the growth projection for 2022 and 23 would have been upgraded. So a loss of momentum, that's the first thing. The second impact that it had was to essentially exacerbate all the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the region. And these were important effects, socio-economic effects, both in terms of the increase in the number of people who fell into poverty. We're talking about 39 million people. The education losses that the children had to contend with. You're talking about an average of 120 days in education losses, and these carry losses and lifetime income. There are studies that shows that, and so essentially bringing back the region a few years into and wiping out the progress that it had made over the past the past 10 years. So, and why are we concerned? We are concerned because even though most of the countries in the region don't have very strong ties, the trade ties with Russia and Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has led to a significant increase in energy and food prices and volatility in global financial markets. That meant that it affects everybody. Now, there are, we mentioned 54 countries in Africa. We look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we are talking about 45 countries in the way we define it at the IMF. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and not all the countries will be impacted the same. So you have, let's say, 8 or so commodity exporting countries that are seeing significant windfall that would come from higher oil prices, higher metal prices, and higher minerals. They will still be hit by higher food prices, though. But then for the majority of the countries, which host the significant part of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa, those countries will take a huge hit in terms of the deterioration and of their terms of trade. The governor read through the increase in the import bills that are related to food and energy, and you could see therefore how external and fiscal balances will be impacted by this shock. But one additional issue that really concerning is that the crisis then hit the region at a time where it has very, very little room for maneuver. There is very little fiscal space. And Governor mentioned the issue with Zambia, the debt distress. We had about 50 or 60% of the low-income countries in the region that are either at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So very limited room for maneuver and room to help the population, the vulnerable population, because this is inflation hits everybody, but it hits the poorest household the most. And so our advice, and where we see now the priorities for governments are threefold. You have the near-term priorities and what we will see more as the medium-term priorities. One is really to provide the support to the most vulnerable households. And that means, providing targeted transfers if the social setting or there are social safety net that are in place to facilitate that. In countries where it is not possible, then you go into these tax rebates and subsidies. But just make sure that it's done in a very temporary or well-defined way, because these are very difficult to take away once you implement them. But all of that needs to be done in a context where the debt issues will need to be addressed and the debt vulnerabilities will need to be reduced. And that means, reprioritizing some of the spending and raising some of the revenues. But let's just face it, this will entail an adjustment over the medium term. And to smooth that, there is a need for financing. And this is where, institutions like this come in. At the IMF, we provide, we're ready to provide support for countries to deal with this shock. But there's also a need for more concessional financing, more grant financing. There's a need, as the governor said, to deal with the G20 common framework to facilitate and reduce the burden of debt on many of the countries. Then you have the issue of tackling inflation. The governor this morning mentioned how difficult his job was. It's, in normal times, this is a difficult job, but at this period, it's even more difficult. Those trade-offs between, inflation and growth are even tougher to contend with and realize. The third near-term challenge that we see across countries is to manage the exchange rate pressures. As countries, advanced economies or the Fed or European central banks accelerate their pace of tightening monetary policy, there's a huge capital inflows that's coming back and leaving our countries in the region toward safety zones. That volatility is creating some capital outflows. And one thing very good thing that has happened to many countries in our region over the past 10, 15 years is the access to capital, access to private capital. And that has also implications in terms of their exposure to the capital flows. I just move quickly to the medium-term challenges that the countries in the region face. One is in terms of promoting diversification, as we say, because some of the countries, the more dependent you are on one crop or one commodity, the more exposed you get to the shock to that commodity. Accelerating, unleashing the private sector, and this is where my colleagues at IFC comes in. The region faces huge financing needs. We are talking about financing needs in the orders of 425 billion when we were looking at 2021 to 2024. You add to that the cost of dealing with climate shocks, which we estimate at 30 to 50 billion. And then now this shock, the war in Ukraine, that has added about 6 to 10 billion just to the import bill of some of the countries in the region. So huge financing needs that will require the participation, private sector, money coming in. We are so at the fund trying very hard to use the SDRs. In 2021 we had the largest issuance of SDRs, special drawing rights, to help the countries cope with COVID-19. But there was also an attempt to get the SDRs of countries that don't need that money, that are in a much better, stronger external position, to then on-lend it to the countries that need it, the countries in the region. And we set up this resilience and sustainability trust to help use that money and help countries deal with the longer term structural issues, transformation issues that we were talking about. It's still not going to, that more will need to be done. And this is, I think, where the private sector is coming in, and where we think that we hope this trust is going to create, have some catalytic effect on some of these funding. Thank you.
I think that's music. Thank you. I think that's music to Samaila Zubairu's ears, because I know that that's one of the things going through your mind. Why aren't we repurposing SDRs, right?
Thank you. I think that the key message we should get from this conversation is what the governor just mentioned, which is that our trade deficit is really the problem that we have. And we have that problem because we export mainly primary commodities and we import finished goods. We have that problem because our value capture is very low or non-existent. Take cocoa, for example. Africa produces 70% of all the cocoa in the world. Our value capture is 6%. Africa produces over 60% of all the cashew in the world. Our value capture is 10%. Africa produces significant proportions of nearly every commodity that we need, especially now that we're thinking about energy transition. And our value capture remains low, which is what we must change going forward. We have to change that. So, for example, we have built industrial zones and industrial parks that is focused on increasing value capture. We have a project that we're looking at transforming cotton from a country. They're earning about $2 billion annually from exporting raw cotton. When we move from cotton export to garmenting and textile, it would increase to about 38 billion. That's about 19 times increase in value. Those are the kind of things that we should focus on to change the narrative and to change our course as a continent. So let's not lose sight of some of the key decisions or key solutions that have come. The trade deficit is something that we should tackle, and I want us to put it front and center going forward. Building local circular economies in Africa is very important, and is what we should do going forward, especially because it also has impact for climate. So we all have targets for carbon reduction, which we don't emit here in Africa, but still we have those targets. Now, what can be meaningful for us as Africans is to stop exporting raw materials and to do local production on the continent. Why? Because the ocean-going voyages increase carbon emissions. And if we can do more production in Africa, we will reduce the trade deficit, we will create more jobs, and we'll earn more money. Those are the things that we should be focusing on. And to do that, we need to financially innovate. We need to look at how can we get more money on the continent. We need to look at things like forced loss, things like blended finance, things like insurance. There again, we need to focus on showing examples of what works in Africa versus the risk that things don't work here. We need to demonstrate that it is possible to make money in Africa, and people have made money in Africa. Africa provides a room for diversification as well as returns, and Africa will remain attractive going forward. So we should be able to use those examples to attract capital into Africa. Then we can use the SDRs in a meaningful way, because we shouldn't use the SDRs to import finished goods. We shouldn't use the SDRs to import fuel and food. We should use the SDRs, repurpose them for production in Africa.
I know His Excellency, the Governor of the Bank, Central Bank of Zambia, has wanted to interject or wanted to respond to, I think probably like you've been waiting patiently, 4 speakers back. So I'm going to give you the floor just to make a very quick intervention, a response really.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Moderator. Yeah, I think I just wanted to build perhaps from a different angle the point that Samaila has raised. I think every crisis has two sides to it in a way. There's the downside, which is what we are bemoaning now about the Ukraine crisis, but it also reveals certain hidden opportunities. Some may not even be hidden, they are there. I talked of the case of Zambia, for example, where we say we defaulted. Is Zambia a basket case? Far from it. Why? Because it still has rich resource endowments. Now, to the point what Smaila said, it's exactly that. If we seize that opportunity now to see what is it that we were importing, which we can do from our own selves, for ourselves, you'll be amazed how much we have. And I think there's a lot of studies which can reveal that. But somehow we have not developed that capacity. This morning, I think we are having a very enlightened conversation with the Secretary General of the AFCTA. Some of the things have to do with what we do ourselves. The kind of policies we have not to allow certain things to move between ourselves. Surely, those are things which are within ourselves. Even if we produce those manufactured goods, if we remain with the barriers that we currently have, that will not do. I think Donald also mentioned something about focusing our eyes on mega trends. One of the mega trends, obviously, is the green climate, green finance and all that. Now, if you take again Zambia, we are producers of copper and there's still a lot of it underground. So if we seized on that, definitely it can uplift the economy and others in the process. So all I wanted to say is that, you see, much as, yes, there are these downside to risks, we can also, if we galvanized ourselves, seize on the opportunities that lie under those crises. And why we are saying, some of us, about the AFCTA is that it's an engine that can help us to transcend country boundaries, where we can work together to get our economies to move forward. Similarly, I think my brother here, AFC, I think he said about equity. Why are we not financing that? Because I think we are looking outside. Now, one of the downside of the crisis coming out of Ukraine is that the interest rates are rising in the West, in particular the US. And we are seeing already some capital reversals, flows going the other side because they want to take advantage of that. And yet, I think in terms of value addition, we have more to say to that. But it's how we organize ourselves. I said something also about PAPs. I think earlier in the day when we were talking with the president here, that one of the major costs we have is transaction costs. Now, with the PAPs developed, some of those transaction costs will come down, which actually would be resources which can be redirected to the development of our economies. So sometimes I think we look out rather than starting out where we are. What opportunities do we have as a continent, as countries? I think we'll be amazed that we have a lot. And a lot of rules are still to be written in our setting. That's why they are able to come and set these rules. So it's about time we used some of these institutions which we have built ourselves, but they are capable of delivering more than what they are doing at the moment. So I just thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, we started off with Dr. Donald Kaberuka giving us an excellent presentation, and then I moved him to the other side of the panel. He's almost our bookend, wouldn't you say, to this panel? So it seems only right that I just give him a couple of minutes to just respond, perhaps to just have the final word on what's been a very interesting conversation. Doctor, go ahead, you have the floor.
Look, I think in the interest of time, I should not say much. I've already said much already, and I agree with everything which have been said here. Just adding one overriding issue is that I've participated in the G20 meetings from the beginning. And please note that apart from South Africa, which sits in the G20 in its own right as South Africa, Africa is totally absent from the G20 where decisions are made. Whether it is on SDRs, whether it is on pandemic, vaccines, we are absent. And so we have to think about what it means when it comes to craft a response to any of these crises in the absence of a seat where decisions are being made. Now, I didn't want to provoke my brother from the IMF because that is not his call, the slowness in quota reform to give Africa a voice. So that reinforces everything you are saying here. We have to begin to look for solutions here. And at that point, we shall be a player in this global market. But the crisis, as I showed you, will happen. I showed you 10 crises in 40 years. Who knows what is coming next? So the art of economic policy is always be ready for the next crisis, but focus on the long-term issues, trade deficit, structural reforms, the kind of things you're mentioning. So I support everything which has been said.
You know, it would be wrong for me not to give the opportunity to our host just to really round up, because, I mean, if you want to say a few words, this mic is yours.
More words, I'll be fired. I think I'm very pleased and proud to be part of this panel. And I say, if we are not honest with ourselves and say what we really believe, why should we come to these gatherings? We don't want to come and say the normal sketches, you know. No, we are coming here because we mean something and we believe in something, and we will have to continue to fight for it, no matter all the opposing and obstructions around us. But we have to understand where is our welfare, because many people don't misunderstand in terms of observers, media, and they will take the community into the wrong direction, and that's very dangerous. So we have to understand where is our welfare, and we will keep doing our best to protect our communities against all these raids. It is a competition. Every country is looking after itself in the world. There is no friendship in benefits and in countries matters. So we have to be alert also and defend ourselves and defend especially that the continent, because we have not scratched the surface, so the upside is tremendous. The upside is tremendous. But we hope that the representative of the African Union will communicate this. One more thing I'd like to say, and I mentioned during my chairmanship to the African Central Bank governors, and I mention it very often, if we are serious about getting together as African countries in trade agreements, monetary unions, etc., we will never be able to do it unless we give real independence to our central banks. And this is my call to the African presidents in the African Union gathering. Let's be honest with ourselves. So, and I asked the African Union ambassador to relay this there, and I hope he did. And we have to confront ourselves. Central banks need to be independent because they are a safeguard for financial stability and for inflation and for the community. And there's the balance, this balance has to be there. So, thank you.
If I could ask you to remain standing, if I could ask all of you to stand up, if I could ask you to give them a lusty round of applause. What a wonderful panel. Thank you so much, gentlemen. You've set the bar so high now. We still have 2 more days, and I don't know how we're going to get a better panel than that. Next, we have what is commonly known as a fireside chat. A fireside chat. I think they want to take a photograph. You guys want to take a photograph? Did you catch it? Gentlemen, if I could ask you to line up, please. They want to take your photograph. We could just take your photograph here. We want to capture something for the history books. Here you goes, gentlemen. Maybe President Obama, you want to join us? You want to join us? You just hop onto the stage here. It would be nice if you join us too. Marvelous. I'll get out of the way. There you go. You've got 15 seconds. Snap, snap, snap. Beautiful. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Wonderful panel. Thank you. Okay. So next, we're going to go right on to what is commonly known as a fireside chat. As the furniture gets shuffled around behind me there, I'm going to tell you the topic. The topic is how can the African Continental Free Trade Area be Africa's path to economic independence? How can the AFCFTA be Africa's path to economic independence? Asking the questions is Mr. Omar Ben Yedder. He's group publisher and managing director of IC Publications. You'll know many of his titles as New African Magazine, African Business, African Banker, and so on and so on. Where's Omar? Omar's over here. Answering the questions is Dr. Howard Nicholas. He's Professor of Economics at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We're talking AFCFTA, Africa's path to economic independence. Ladies and gentlemen, these are your speakers and your moderator. Give them a round of applause. Let's get moving. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Mark, for those warm introductions. So if I'm here today, it's because my group has often taken a contrarian line to orthodox thinking. And today we've got a fantastic speaker who's also going to challenge what orthodoxy and what's been said by the central bank governor of Egypt. I mean, we know that we haven't got perpetual friends or eternal enemies, just perpetual and eternal interests, and it's about fighting for our interests that will achieve economic independence, which is the next challenge for this continent. So we're going to start with a brief presentation from Professor Howard Nicholas, followed by a Q&A. So Professor, the floor is yours. If you can please take your seats, everyone. If you can please take your seats. If we can please take your seats, Professor Howard Nicholas is going to start his presentation. If we could please sit down, everyone. If we can please take your seats.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, remember we have to be out of this room by 7 p.m. so the clock is ticking. If I could ask everybody to please take their seats. It's very important that you take your seats so that so we can get Howard Nicholas's presentation underway. So everybody over there, please sit down. Everybody over here mingling in the corner, much as it's great to make friends. If I could ask everybody over here. Yes, I'm talking to you, sir, the handsome looking, yes, you, and the lovely lady in the nice dress. I'm going to stop pointing people out if they don't sit down. I'm even talking to some more famous individuals over here. If you could please take a seat so we can continue. Sir, I think you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Afreximbank Thank you very much for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. I have a rule: never, ever lecture after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Never. And that's because everyone is tired, and the title already indicates boredom is upon you. But I'll try and make it brief. My task is made much easier by the governor of Egypt's central bank, because he actually stole much of my argumentation. I don't mean that literally, but literally he said a lot of things I wanted to say. And he said it far more eloquently than I'm going to say it. So I'm sorry on both counts. Firstly, that it's late in the afternoon. Secondly, that I'm following such a distinguished panel. Well, what I'm going to argue is in the context of my home country. Many of you don't realize I am Sri Lankan. I don't look Sri Lankan because my ancestors came from Europe 300 years ago. But I am Sri Lankan. My grandfather was the Postmaster General of Sri Lanka. And I have been involved in Sri Lankan policy discussions, business community, for nearly 40 years. I set up a think tank for the government of Sri Lanka nearly 35 years ago. Why this is relevant is this. As many of you would know, Sri Lanka is in a terrible mess at the moment. Anyone, can you put your hands up if you know that? Yes, you know that? Yes. Why this is important is because it has a bearing on the situation in Africa. When I read the media, when I read the Western media, when I read the Sri Lankan media, they say, oh, Sri Lanka's currency crisis is the fault of corrupt politicians. They say the currency crisis is the fault of the governor of the central bank doing stupid things. But they always miss the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that, like African countries, we in Sri Lanka have been prevented from going down the industrialization road, especially the export-oriented industrialization road. What I want to argue here is, if the Africa Free Trade Agreement does not pay heed to export-oriented industrialization, it's not going to do very much for Africa. This is my argument. We in Sri Lanka, we have tried industrialization. We have tried industrialization, but import substituting industrialization. That's what we've done. And we've always ended up with a currency crisis, always. African countries did the same thing. Don't forget the 1970s. Don't forget the 80s. When you don't earn foreign exchange in the context of your industrialization, you are going to hit a crisis. 3 years ago, I gave a whole series of public lectures saying Sri Lanka was headed for a foreign exchange crisis. Did the government listen to anything I said? No, they didn't. Did the business community listen to what I said? Yes, they did. Do you know what the business community, many business people did? They started siphoning dollars out of the country. And today they're making a fortune because the currency has collapsed. They're now bringing dollars back into the country and converting it into rupees and buying property all over the place. The government didn't listen to me, but the business people listened because they understood the argument I was making. We have had crisis after crisis after crisis in Sri Lanka, just like sub-Saharan Africa. But nobody ever blames the fact that we have been blocked from going down the export-oriented industrialization path. Now I'm going to show you a few charts to prove my point. If anyone can contradict me, I'll be very happy to hear that contradiction. But whenever I present this, there's always tremendous silence, especially on the part of government officials, but also foreign economists. They actually cannot contradict the charts that I'm going to show you, okay? And let me go quickly. We all know why industrialization now. Because as our incomes rise, we don't buy more food items, we buy more manufactures. That's what we do. One of the things that we know about manufacturing production is that it allows for lots and lots of diversification, which in turn allows for a lot of employment creation. So these are standard arguments. We also know this graph. Well, probably you don't know this graph. It's done by my son, so you wouldn't know this graph. But this is to show the deindustrialization that has taken place in Africa. So what you see here is manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. This consistent fall is what people refer to as deindustrialization. And this is then, it is argued that this is really the cause of many of the problems. Hence, we now have the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And it's argued that if I look at this data, Africa has a huge potential to exploit if we can have one common market, one common African market. Look at the intra-African trade is negligible compared to the intra-other continental trade. So this is the justification for the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and it's a strong one. And these are the benefits that are cited. I'm rushing through this because this has already been discussed. However, I want you to note the defragmentation of trade and regulatory landscape. Okay, so this has been stressed over and over again. I've read it many times in many international reports. And then there are the other normal things. But I'm going to argue this is not enough. There's going to be definitely evidence, and the evidence is not going to be that difficult to come by in the coming years, that you have to go for export-oriented industrialization. This is not something the Western countries want to hear. All the Western countries are interested in, as the governor of the Egypt Central Bank said, is a market in Africa for their goods. That's all they're interested in. That's why for them, the Africa Free Trade Agreement actually spells a very large gain for especially European companies, but also American and Asian companies. What I'm going to argue is this, that from the word go, African countries have to start producing higher value-added manufactured goods. Producing garments and textiles and low value-added manufactures is not going to help. In fact, I can guarantee you African countries will again hit foreign exchange problems. I guarantee you. Unless African countries move up the value chain from the very beginning. Why is this important? Because one of the reasons for doing this is it encourages very rapid technological change. We can see this from all developing countries that have moved down this path. They experience very rapid technological change. We know that there's fantastic opportunities for diversification into higher and higher value-added goods. Why that is important is it will allow African producers to pay higher and higher wages. Otherwise, African workers will be condemned to low wages. Look at the garments industries. Look at the low value-added manufacturing industries. They're always paying very low wages. Most important of all is the last item, that it overcomes the foreign exchange block. Why? Because this is the only way you're going to have a trade surplus. There's no other way that you're going to actually have a trade surplus. And here is my evidence. This is China. Now China, if you look here, I just want you to see. Sorry, I shouldn't walk away from the microphone. If you look at 1980, this was long before China really started their aggressive development. China had very high manufacturing to GDP, but actually it meant nothing to China. It didn't do very much for the economy. It's only once they started to switch to higher value-added manufacturing that the change came. I use this, and this is my key chart. This is the one that I want everyone to concentrate on. This is not my chart, this is my son. We've taken 164 developing countries. 164 developing countries. We've split them into two groups: the industrializing developing countries and the raw material producers. The raw material producers include those specializing in garments and textiles, like Bangladesh. But it excludes garments producers who have diversified into other manufactured items. Look at the difference. For those industrializing countries, they never get into trade imbalances except for very, very short periods. For all the others, they get into trade imbalances. This is why every time there's a shock in the global economy, automatically these countries get hit. Automatically. So when we had COVID, Sri Lanka went into a debt spiral, basically. What happened to Vietnam? I'm going to show you Vietnam. This is a country that I've been following very closely. Around 2012, Vietnam shifted out of the production of low value-added manufactures into higher value-added manufactures. They shifted with the help of foreign multinationals. From that point on, Vietnam had consistent trade surpluses. When developing countries were suffering in 2020 and 2021, what was happening in Vietnam? Vietnam was going in the other direction. Their trade surplus was exploding upwards. Their reserves were rising precipitously, while we in Sri Lanka had the beginning of our foreign exchange crisis. We heard the governor of Zambia tell us how they had a foreign exchange crisis, but Vietnam had the opposite. Vietnam accumulated vast amounts of foreign exchange. How did they do that? Well, Vietnam by this time had a diversified manufacturing base. When everyone in the Western world was shifting to home office work, what Vietnam did was they started to produce home office equipment. And they made a fortune, literally made a fortune. The Vietnamese companies that I am invested in, for example, their share prices increased by 40%, while most of the rest of the world was experiencing weakening share prices. In Vietnam, we saw the opposite. Okay, what do we do? And here, I don't want to dismiss the free trade agreement as having a role to play in promoting export-oriented industrialization. I don't want to dismiss that. What I will say is that it's only part of the story, and basically most of the policies should be oriented towards promoting export-oriented industrialization. How do we do that? Well, one thing is we can encourage joint ventures. If you want to access the African market, you should come and also produce with African companies. But if not, then we find ways to actually disadvantage you compared to the foreign companies that are going to do joint ventures. Now, this is very important for us because we cannot reinvent the wheel. When Vietnam went for higher value-added manufacturing, what did they do? What they did was they asked foreign multinationals to come in and do joint ventures with them. Crucially, they were able to do this because they played a geopolitical card. The geopolitical card Vietnam played was, we hate China. So the Vietnamese told the West, we hate China like you hate China. Why don't you relocate some of your production to us? And that's precisely what Western companies did. One company in particular is Samsung Electronics. Samsung invested $3 billion in 2012. $3 billion, and transferred most of their smartphone production to Vietnam. The Vietnamese asked Samsung, what do you want? Well, we want tax concessions. Done. We want concessions on imports. Done. We want this. Done. We want that. Done. Anything else, they asked Samsung? Samsung couldn't think of anything else. So what the Vietnamese did was they said, okay, Hanoi Airport, Ho Chi Minh Airport, you have your own immigration line, so you don't have to stay in queues. What Vietnam wanted was Samsung. They didn't want to wait till all the infrastructure was done, this, that, and the other. No, no. They wanted a foreign multinational to come and start producing high value-added exports. What they did was set up local companies doing the same thing. Today, Vietnam produces a vast array of high value-added manufacturers. You might not know this statistic, but Vietnam today, export value of Vietnamese goods exceeds all of India. All of India. So Vietnam with a population of 100 million, India with a population of 1.3 billion, Vietnam today exports more dollar value than all of India put together. And it's going at a tremendous pace. There are other considerations, and these have already been mentioned. These have already been mentioned by other speakers. You can't have an industrialization strategy without food security. You can't have an industrialization strategy without energy security. But here, perhaps unlike the other speakers, perhaps they were being diplomatic, what I think is really needed is for African countries together to form one united front and renegotiate trade deals. Renegotiate trade deals on an intercontinental basis. One of the things African countries have to pressure for is an ending of the agreement on agriculture at the WTO. They have to do that. Otherwise, it's impossible to get a food security policy. African countries should have the right to subsidize food production. This is very important that African countries unite together and renegotiate. I will mention one particularly important thing that it's the elephant in the room. We don't like to talk about it. The African Free Trade Agreement refers constantly to non-tariff barriers between African countries and how those should be eliminated. But nowhere has it been mentioned that the real non-tariff barriers faced by African economies trying to export is in the advanced country markets. Developing countries as a group have tried in the last 5 multilateral trade negotiations, the last 5, to get non-tariff barriers put as an item for discussion. Every single time, US and Europe have refused to allow it to be put on the agenda. I think Africa should now use its power, join with other developing countries and say, no, sorry, we now want non-tariff barriers put on the agenda. What are these? These are things like commodity standards, where if European country doesn't like what you're exporting to them because it's competing with one of their goods, they simply block it, say it doesn't meet technical standards. Now we know this is happening, but nobody says anything. I think that the Africa Free Trade Agreement should not only look at the intra-Africa non-tariff barriers, they should also look at the intercontinental non-tariff barriers. I end with this. It says I'm an academic. Right, I am an academic, but I'm also an investor. All my academic career, I've invested my money. I've looked to see the countries that are going to give me the biggest return. I discovered a long time ago that it was only countries that follow export-oriented industrialization strategies, only those. I started to follow China in 1995. I started contacting my old Chinese students and asking them, could I teach in China? I'd really like to learn what's happening. And in 2000, I got the opportunity to teach in China. That was the moment I knew I had to hold RMB. Whenever I had a class, I used to tell my students, look, if you want to exchange your dollars for RMB, I'm happy to do it. Because if I asked everyone in the class, would you rather have dollars than RMB? They said, yes, yes, we want dollars. And I said, okay, I'm going to make you a bet. In 10 to 15 years' time, you're going to regret making that statement. Because once China moves down this export-oriented industrialization path, it's going to be one of the richest countries in the world. You know, they all laughed at me at the beginning. They said, it's not possible. Same thing. In 2012, when I saw what was happening in Vietnam, I contacted my old students and I said, "Can I teach in Vietnam?" "Sure, professor, come." I started to study Vietnam. In 2016, when I sold all my bonds because it was the end of the bond bull run, I had to decide what to do with this money. I put half of it in Sri Lanka, still hoping, and half of it in Vietnam. In Sri Lanka, I kept the money in dollars. In Vietnam, I converted all of it into dong and put everything into the stock market. What do you think the difference was? If I had put my money into Sri Lanka, I'd have lost 85 to 90% of that money. In Vietnam, it has risen by 120%. Why is this important? Well, I don't think Africa should be looking for anyone's charity. I think if you do the right thing, people will be begging to come and invest in your countries. I certainly will. I assure you, and here's a promise, I will put it in black and white. If Africa goes down the export-oriented industrialization path, I will sell everything I have in every country in the world and I will put it in Africa. Because, as one speaker said, this is a very low bottom. The upward movement is incredible. Let me tell you, in 10 years, if I don't increase the dollar earnings of my investment by 500%, I'll be really disappointed. I expect it to rise even more than that. But it requires ignoring advice that you're given. It requires courage on the part of African leaders. It requires greater integration, economic integration. It requires an accelerated move towards customs union and monetary union. But most of all, start now. Don't wait. Start now attracting foreign investors who are going to produce in Africa. Africa is not open for raw material production per se, it's open for higher value-added manufacturing production. And once you start, you will see the changes will be precipitous. You will not be suffering these foreign exchange scourges which have bedeviled Africa. I just have one small recommendation to make. I think it's time for Africa to have its own international monetary fund. I think it's time. Why this is important is because when Africa is hit by shocks, as with the case of, now we see Zambia, but there are others lined up. I have read that 23 countries, there are 23 countries on the verge of applying for structural adjustment assistance. What's going to happen is that that assistance is going to undermine your industrialization efforts, I assure you. How do I know that? Because it has happened to Sri Lanka every single time. We've had 17 agreements with the IMF, 17. Every single time we go to the IMF, they tell us to do something that is destructive to our industrialization strategy. One of those things they did, which I consider is criminal, is they asked us to privatize our development banks. They know full well that development banking is extremely important for industrialization. They know it. It's not a secret. Yet they asked us to privatize our 2 development banks. And I can go on, I can tell you lots and lots of other examples. Why? Because this is an economic war. You think they really want Africa to industrialize and start to compete with them in the same goods they produce? Remember, you are sitting on the raw materials. You're sitting on the raw materials. You use them to start producing high value added goods. Come on, I don't need to spell it out. The danger that poses to the current world order is monstrous. I think I end there. Thank you.
Dr. Nicholas, thank you if you can join me here. Thank you very much. That was very insightful and a lot to unpack. So when I met Dr. Nicholas today, he told me just call me Howard. And the reason he said call me Howard is because he doesn't teach textbook economics. He doesn't see himself as a professor or as a lecturer. He sees himself as someone who teaches business economics. So practical economics that are tied to the real, that is tied to the real world. So look, I don't want to go in any particular direction. I want to go into lots of different directions, if you don't mind. I want to start with Sri Lanka, first of all. The reason being is that people are looking at Sri Lanka, and I don't want to cite any other African countries, but people are saying, okay, Sri Lanka could be what certain African countries will be in a year's time or in 2 years' time. We're seeing higher interest rates. We're seeing it tough to go to markets today and borrow at sustainable interest rates. And we're seeing a certain debt trap. So first of all, I know that you think that the global financial framework is broken to some extent, and we are in a sort of, and countries get caught in this trap, in this vicious cycle as opposed to a virtuous one. So what are the lessons learned from Sri Lanka? And are you also worried about this debt trap, and also people worry about the exposure to Chinese debt, more specifically?
It's really good that you raised this, Omar, because one thing that I didn't mention, which I've mentioned in many presentations in Sri Lanka, is we are now in a more enviable position than we have been. You see, we are in the position of Vietnam. We actually can play the geopolitical card now. We have now India wanting to cultivate us. We have China wanting to cultivate us. And now we have the United States and Europe wanting to cultivate us. What I've been telling the Sri Lankan government is we say to everyone, we are independent, but we will do business with everyone. So if you want to send us your companies to start production, we're very happy. The Indians are already doing it, incidentally. And now we're negotiating with the Japanese. The Japanese want to give Sri Lanka $5 billion. And what I'm suggesting to the Sri Lankan government is we don't want the money, we want it to come with production. This is what it's about. And why I think this is important is this window will not last forever. But it's a very important window. This is a moment that Africa, as one united group, can negotiate, and negotiate very, very good terms. Now, a lot of Sri Lankans say, oh, we can get more loans at more concessional rates. They're missing the point. It should be set up your production base. Use this opportunity to set up your production base. Don't just borrow money to pay off debts and to service debts and so on. Rather, use this opportunity to set up your production base. It's not going to come again. But I think if Africa takes this opportunity, anyway, you'll have my money, for sure. I will certainly invest in Africa and hope to make a lot of money out of it.
Thank you. I mean, you talk about bargaining power, and hopefully the AFCFTA and a single voice will give the African continent more bargaining power, even though we're still seeing deals done between certain countries at a bilateral level, between the USA, I won't name, or I think it's USA and Kenya, I'll name it, last year, and the USA, the British, and the EU to some extent are trying to still sign bilateral deals as opposed to Africa saying, okay, no, we need to negotiate with one single voice on our terms. So someone recently said that you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So you're saying that we should be very careful in terms of these bilateral deals.
Yes, I think the bilateral deals, I mean, one of the problems I see with the CFTA is that it's based on the EPAs, the old EPAs. And those were, in effect, bilateral deals in a context of divide and conquer. So the Europeans arbitrarily sliced up Africa and said, okay, we're going to negotiate with this bloc, with this bloc, with this bloc. And now they're encouraging Africa to use the EPAs as a basis for the Africa Free Trade Agreement. What I'm suggesting is that we say, no, sorry, that was imposed on us. We cannot accept that as something that was imposed on us as a basis for negotiating our own FTA. What we now need is to renegotiate as a continent with your continent. And what you imposed on us has to be scrapped. And I think now is the moment to literally say that.
Okay, so the previous session was about, well, it was supposed to be about Russia and Ukraine. And actually, if I look at the past 6 months, one thing that struck me is that Russia has been pretty resilient ultimately, given the sanctions and given everything that's happened. So we saw that they actually been developing their own payment system over the past few years, so they didn't have to rely on SWIFT and all the other global payment systems out there. In terms of the reserves, they built up reserves, so they're obviously planning for certain type of autonomy. And I'm not saying we should, cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, but how do we achieve this sovereignty? Do we need to look at our own payment systems? Do we need to start putting our reserves within our own institutions and our own frameworks so that they're safe to some extent? What are your thoughts in terms of these points?
Well, one thing that I've been recommending again to the Sri Lankan government is to do bilateral swaps. I think this is very important now. So we have just been offered by Russia a swap arrangement for oil. And actually we can do far better than that because 29% of all our tourists are all Russians. So there's actually a big ruble inflow potential which can bypass the dollar. Now, we're also starting to talk to the Chinese about bilateral swaps using the yuan. We're not the only ones. We know that Saudi Arabia is doing this with their oil exports. I think this is the way that African countries should grow. But here's the problem. Where the need for monetary union comes in is it becomes really complicated to have dozens of swap deals. It's much easier if there's one currency, or at least if the currencies are linked. And if you have the swap deals in the context of an African IMF, then I think that many of the problems can be somewhat allayed that you face today. But I'm very much in favor of swaps going forward.
So look, I don't follow Sri Lanka that closely, but I was told that in terms of its trade imbalance and its deficit, that obviously tourism was an issue. Obviously, to some extent, debt. But also, I was told that actually the government made a policy decision to use organic fertilizers as opposed to chemical fertilizers, and that also contributed to having to import foods and to be less self-reliant on that front. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. This is part of what I mentioned earlier, and maybe it was missed, and that is the import substituting industrialization discussion. Because what you are now having in Sri Lanka, or what you had, was a government that came in and said, no, we are not going for exports, we're going to substitute the manufactured imports that we have, one of which was fertilizer. So overnight, they went to organic fertilizer and banned all chemical fertilizer imports. For me, the problem is this was part and parcel of a strategy that we know from past experience always ends up with a currency crisis. The reason is that you still have to import a lot of inputs and machinery to produce the import substituting goods. And when you don't have the money to do that, you start borrowing. And that's exactly what we were doing. You know, we started borrowing more and more and more, and eventually we, after being downgraded to junk bond status, we eventually defaulted. So from my point, the government's whole import substituting strategy is a non-starter. It worries me that a lot of the discussion about the Africa Free Trade Agreement is justified on the basis of import substituting industrialization. I'm very worried about that. And that's why I say from the word go, export-oriented industrialization, going to higher and higher value-added goods should be built in.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll get to the AFCFTA in a second. And I mean, I think the point is that we're still importing too many finished goods, whilst we should be producing more of those finished goods and trading amongst ourselves. So establishing a base in Ghana or in Alexandria and exporting to all of North Africa and to the eastern coast of Africa. But coming back to, you mentioned about nationalizations and privatizations of banks, or privatization of banks, should I say. I mean, I was speaking to some Egyptians here, and I know that they're going through a privatization process, let's say. They're privatizing a lot of industries, and I believe that there was talk of privatizing 2 profit-making state-owned banks. So what are your thoughts there? Because when I look at China, I see that they've got very strong banks supporting local industry, state-owned banks. So what are your thoughts in terms of state-owned banks? Should you privatize them, or should, on the contrary, you should have these strong state-owned banks that can support this rapid industrialization?
Well, I actually believe in private enterprise. I mean, that's for me core. And why I believe in it is because you get the most innovation when you have competition between private firms. It also applies to banks. Here is the qualification. It applies to commercial banks and trade financing banks. But the key thing that we know from all successful East Asian countries, and I mean all, there's not one exception, is state development banks. State development banks. What does that mean? It means, so I'm teaching in China, and one of my students, he comes to the front of the class and he puts a little object on the table. This is 2005. And he says, you know, everything you're teaching us, Professor, I can tell you with this one object. This was the brain of night vision technology. Night vision technology. The Bank of China gave this company a huge loan to develop night vision technology. They said first 5 years, no capital repayment. The top interest they had to pay was 4%, but if they achieved within 2 years an increase in export value earnings, it was dropped to 3.5%. And it went like that, kept going down. And he told me the end of that story. He said, after 15 years, they canceled the loan. We didn't have to repay. But what we had to do was to take another loan and develop a totally new product. So I said, so what was that new product? He said, sorry, Professor, I'm not allowed to tell you this. What it means, development banking cannot be commercial because there's no bank in any developing country that can lend for 20 years at 4%. Imagine if they had lent for 20 years at 4% in 2019. Imagine what would have happened now with interest rates going sky high. The bank would have gone bankrupt, you know? That's why it has to be a state development bank. I always ask this question. In 1995, when we got into trouble, why did the IMF ask us to privatize our 2 state development banks? Why? Because we have state commercial banks. We have a state trade finance bank. But they wanted these 2 banks privatized. And my answer is, it's economic war. Sorry, if you haven't got this before, get it now. It's economic war. And these institutions are used in a war. They're not bad institutions. The people running them are not bad human beings. It's a war. When Africa becomes a successful continent, you think Africa is going to behave differently? Come on. You know, you will try and suppress the other ones, the others who are trying to get to your level. This is the way the war is fought. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And that's where we have to have intellectuals, academics, who have independent thinking. Because what happened for the privatization of these banks was they brought American and Australian professors to Sri Lanka, who gave the financial liberalization thesis. If you liberalize the financial sector, if you privatize these banks, then actually the banks will be more efficient and they'll attract more finance and there'll be more funding available for the companies. Has that worked with the privatization of our 2 state development banks? No. Before the privatization, average loan period was 9 years. 9 years. After privatization, average loan period is 1.5 years. They became commercial banks. Before privatization, average interest rate was 4%. After privatization, average interest rate is 12%. Okay? They became commercial banks. We don't have a source of concessional long-term financing. And that is why I would say the African Development Bank has a huge role to play, because you're talking of fixed capital formation. Fixed capital formation. Eximbank is working capital, trade finance. But African Development Bank, that's why they're not competing with one another. I know somebody said that they're competing. They can't be competing. They shouldn't be competing. Because you need a state trade financing bank and you need a state fixed capital formation bank. These are 2 different banks and they're vital for the whole project to work. But I can assure you, you will have lots of intellectual criticisms. People will be sent to Africa and they will say, oh no, you must liberalize your financial markets because of blah, blah, blah. Okay?
Excellent. Look, I believe, is Dr. Fofak here? I'm not sure if Dr. Fofak from the Afreximbank is here, because I know he had a question for you. Is he not here? Okay, look, I believe that we've got to wrap up. They're telling me that the next speakers are here. But thank you very much. If this is the first time you've heard...
Mr. Lufte, you wanted to triple your economy by 2030. That is a lot of consumption. That is a huge amount of demand. Can the world... Is the world geared to support your growth or your growth ambition?
Well, I don't...
Yeah, sorry. So if you... if this is the first time you've heard Dr. Nicholas, I suggest you go on YouTube, and he's got a great critique of what's held back development on the continent, including a critique of global financial framework and global trade framework. But you'll be able to catch up with him tonight and throughout the days. So a great warm round of applause to our professor here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you, Omar Ben Yedder, the publisher and editor of IC Publications there, for handling that very interesting session. Now, we've come very close to the end. We have just one last very short 30-minute session to go. But before I tell you what that is, I just have a few items, housekeeping items I just want to tell you about. So if I could just have your attention. I mentioned that we've got to be out of this building. In 1 hour by 7 p.m. For security reasons, they want to check out the building. So everybody, every human here has to be out of this building by 7. You have to get your antigen tests. I've got mine in the medical tent next to the registration tent. It doesn't tell me when it's open until, but it just says open until and then it's blank. So I would just go after after we leave here. Also, your hotels may also, that I understand the hotels, there's antigen tests in 9 of the hotels. Please see something called your security email. There's an email sent to you, I think yesterday, a security email that gives you details, but you must enter this building tomorrow. You must be in the building by 9 a.m. Doors will be closed. His Excellency President LCC is coming with his entourage, and you won't be let in after 9 a.m. You're also invited to a cocktail reception that's tonight, I believe, by the Central Bank of Egypt, hosting a cocktail reception. Shuttle buses leave from gate 4 at 6:30 in about 30 minutes or so when we've concluded. So those are the items I have to tell you. Now, the Danish existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard famously once said, "You live life looking forward, you understand life looking backward." Our next session is a reflection on the history and on the future of Africa's integration in this changing world of ours. The speaker was supposed to have been His Excellency President Olusegun Obasanjo, the former president of Nigeria. But these days, despite his advanced years, he's still very much in demand for Africa, and he is the AU Horn of Africa Peace Envoy. And for that, he's on call, effectively. And there was an emergency of some sort that required his attention. And unfortunately, and very uncharacteristically, I mean, he couldn't help it, he had to leave. But he did designate a worthy replacement for you. I would like to welcome back a gentleman who's always has a keen eye for the trends that shape our continent. You heard from him earlier, so I want you to put, I know it's late in the evening, but just rally yourselves and please put your hands together for Dr. Donald Kabureka, Chairman of the Board of Directors, Southbridge Group, and former President of the African Development Bank. Thank you so much, Dr. K. Now, to moderate, the honor of interviewing him falls to a moderator of high renown in Africa. You'll recognize her if you've seen her on CNBC in the past, and now she is the founder of the Nielsen Network. Ladies and gentlemen, Bronwyn Nielsen. Bronwyn.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you so much for your attention. We've had a great day of interaction, much thought leadership, and Dr. Kabaruka, I know that you gave a resounding speech earlier today. We are talking about the legacy of integration of Africa, and I don't think there's anybody better positioned to give a sense of where we've come from, what you've seen, and we won't spend too much time on the legacy. We will move to the future. But give me a sense of the progress that you've identified at this stage.
Thank you. Good evening. Obviously, as you can see, I'm not President Obasanjo. Number two, I don't think anybody can replace President Obasanjo. But I want to extend apologies on his behalf. Actually, we traveled together yesterday here. So which means he meant to be here with you. But if you had to be absent, it is because it is something very, very urgent. So please accept his apologies. No, I can be very brief on question of integration and its legacy. Number one, it's a bit of history, and many people in this room are quite young. But it's important I say it the way I will say it. When the precursor of the African Union was being formed, it was called the Organization of African Unity. At that time, less than 35 countries in Africa were independent. Others, like South Africa and many others, were not yet. A decision was taken that colonial borders, which we inherited, should not be reopened. They should be accepted as that. People accepted these were colonial borders. They were artificial in many cases. They didn't make sense. But if you reopen them up, it will be a huge Pandora's box. But there was a second agreement that we should do everything possible to integrate our economies as much as we can. Because there was a realization that unless there was economic integration, political independence would be very difficult to materialize for the people in terms of socio-economic well-being. Since then, a lot of things have happened. Different regions of Africa are different stages of integration. You know, at some point, the East African community, to give you an idea, was far more advanced than the European Union of today. We have regions of Africa today inside the ECOWAS region which have gone all the way to monetary integration, right? Which is the highest level of economic integration. We have others which are still at the lower end, which would be the preferential trade areas. So it has been very variable. And I think with the coming into place of the Continental Free Trade Area, we're going to see acceleration of the same process.
Now, just having come back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, I'm hoping this is working. Thank you, it's okay, so I'll use this one. Having just come back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, it was a summer Davos. The big topic there was deglobalization. Everybody is basically becoming more isolated, more protectionist, rather than integration. And many may say to you, Dr. Kabaruka, that we're late to the party. When the world is actually now turning to protectionist policies, we are moving to integration. What is your response to them?
That is exactly the right response. But let me tell you about this deglobalization. I'm quite skeptical myself. I've heard the word like deglobalization, decoupling. It is true that there are some sectors, I think, where there should be decoupling, especially those where there could be double use, civilian use and military use. In those components, things could happen. But I think the global supply chains have been so integrated, that to try to unmake them is like trying to make an egg out of an omelette, so to speak. I think it cannot happen the way people are describing it. I think what is going to happen because of this issue with global supply chains, you're going to see this thing now being called near-shoring, friendly shoring, that kind of thing. That will happen because you'll go from where's the cheapest location of my production to where is the most secure, most reliable. That will happen, as in vaccines, as in some food products. But that is not the same thing as deglobalization. I think we have gone far in the last 40 years to reverse deglobalization, but there'll be challenges around decoupling of some sectors. So I think.
If we look at Africa and we look at the opportunity now that is presented from the fact that we're going to involve multi-sourcing when it comes to supply chains, we can very quickly put ourselves on the global stage if we get our act together, so to speak. And I think, Dr. Kabaruka, we've probably been having these conversations for a decade. But the time is now to capitalize on the environment that is ripe for Africa to actually take center stage given the richness of our resources. And we are a key breadbasket opportunity for the world as well as we go into this global food crisis. So perhaps time has never been better for us not only to integrate through the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also to take our rightful position on the global stage.
Yeah, so three short comments. Number one, three things are so critical in the next 50 years. And I think how we position ourselves there is what will determine what you say. Number one, this energy transition, which is now a bit more slower than before, would mean that a number of African countries have huge opportunities in some metals which are involved in the transition to electrical vehicles and so on. I hope and expect we don't make the same mistake we made before of relying on exporting those raw materials to others. I hope we can add value to them here on the continent, whether it's cobalt, whether it is the other products which you know.
Even platinum.
Even platinum.
Industrialized platinum.
Yeah. So that is one revolution we cannot afford to miss, is we transit from fossil fuel-based energies to another form of industrialization, which happens, by the way, once every 150 years. Once in every 150 years, you have this kind of transitions. This is why we need to focus ourselves. As for agriculture, it is possible, it is feasible to be part of the global agricultural value chains. That is not rocket science. I think what has been missing has been a number of policies, things around maybe rain-dependent agriculture, lack of logistics and infrastructure around agriculture, the things you know very well. But also, I should add, global agricultural subsidies, which are still a huge impediment for we in Africa as we want to add value to our products.
How quickly can we transform the agricultural landscape? I mean, this, again, is a question you have been asked over and over again on many different stages across Africa and across the world. But as you say, if we manage to integrate and we manage to get the right policies, regulation, we turn subsistence farming into commercial farming, that's a reality in the next 5 years, sir?
Let me just give an example of a country which transformed its agriculture inside a decade, just 10 years. And this was Vietnam. After the war in Vietnam, they had a large army of 1 million men. I think they demobilized, and then the government started to do a number of things to support these demobilized people to become farmers. If you visit the highlands of Vietnam, where they grow rice, which we import a lot of it, actually a lot of experts who went to teach Vietnamese how to grow coffee, cocoa, and rice were Africans. You find Kenyans, Ethiopians, Ugandans, maybe even South Africans. And now Vietnam is, I think, one of the top 5 agricultural economies in the world. So it can happen. What has to be done on the supply side, on the policy side, on infrastructure, is well known, and it can be done.
There's a theme that we haven't really touched on here at the annual meetings for Afreximbank, and that is climate change. Now, I am the chair of Grasa Michel's Women in Media Network, and Mama Michelle always says to me, we do not need to worry about climate change. We did not create the problem, and we have more urgent issues to deal with, including the fact, as you mentioned, that almost 500 million people, more than 500 million people on the African continent don't have access to energy of any form. But if we bring this very topical conversation to the fore, we know that COP27 is happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, here in Egypt, in November. How do we play as the African continent in that dialogue?
So we have to be careful here. We have to worry a lot about climate change because we be the continent most affected and with the capacity to cope with it. So that is a fact. It's a scientific fact. The second is true that we did not cause climate change. That is also a fact. What that means is that we have what is known in this business as common but differentiated responsibilities. And our view of this is that there has to be what is known as a just transition. And a just transition means that those responsible for climate change have to finance a large part of the transition. That is where the challenge has been, whether it is emissions or adaptation or technology transfer. But I go to this. It's very important for many of our leaders to get this right. When Great Britain was industrializing, it was on the basis of coal. As I said, this is a once in every 150 years event. When the US was beginning its industrialization on the basis of oil. China is already a leader in green energies. Not just green energies, it's green energies and digital. It's getting there. We really have to think hard about where we place ourselves in the new industrial revolution, which, as I say, is a once in every 150 years happening. And if we accept that we have to move in that direction, we have then to defend everything to do with a just energy transition, which must include ending energy poverty for 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia who don't have access to energy. But that energy, if financing was available, could actually be provided by a lot of green sources which you have in Africa. Think of Ingada, think of the Zambezi, think of the solar, think of the geothermal. If you're talking about availability of green resources, we have all of it in Africa. But it costs $1 million to get a megawatt of hydropower. Someone has to finance it. It's as simple as that.
So it's been a long day, Dr. Kabaruka, and I think we must move back to the topic at hand. And I've just got 2 more questions for you. The one issue is back to integration of Africa, the free movement of goods, services, and people. Now, something amazing has happened over what has been a devastating time for many over COVID-19. And when I say something amazing, it has been the transition to understand that services can be delivered anywhere, at any time, if you have the right platforms, if you have the right connectivity. And when we talk to integration, and I know this is a theme that has been touched on today, is that we have the free movement of services upon us as we speak. We can deliver from here in Cairo into Kigali in Rwanda, again, via the right technology. But is that not really the catalyst for further integration? Is that services are running far ahead of products and people?
So that does not negate the need for us in Africa to make progress on the single air market and movement of people across our continent. What is happening in the digital space is an accelerator, as you call it. But we need absolutely to work hard in line with the existing policies to permit free movement of people across Africa, as countries like Seychelles, like Rwanda, Mauritius have done. By the way, with huge benefits all across. Now, I think that if we can address some of the zero-sum calculus, some of the fears around free movement of people, we could actually make those services even more effective. And I do believe that for me, in this CFTA, if we address single air market, free movement of people, we address some things around procurement, some of these red tape, and then, since we are at the Afreximbank meeting, the payment system which is being advocated. That would be a huge accelerator to what you have just said, which is digitalization.
The final question, and I don't want you to leave this stage without saying what you believe should be said before we stand down. So I'm going to say that if there is one question you wanted me to ask you while we are on stage together, what would that be?
So, I spoke at length here about there's a feeling of doomsday there's a feeling of crisis across many of low-income countries at the moment. And that is for the right reason, because we're just recovering from COVID, and suddenly we have these disruptions in the global supply for food, energy, and fertilizers. And the numbers look quite calamitous. But I want to leave this room with a sense of hope that I did mention to you the 10, 12 huge crises Africa has gone through. And each time our response has been well crafted, the right one. We have been bruised but recovered. I do believe that the panels which spoke today all spoke in the sense of, yes, that is a given, it's a crisis, like COVID, like others before, but we can actually manage out of this if A, we strengthen our resilience in terms of crisis management, if we stay focused on addressing the bottlenecks. The governor mentioned the trade surplus, others mentioned a couple of other things. If we stayed focused on the long-term trends, the structural bottlenecks, and continue to strengthen our crisis management, we could get there. It is true in a place like North Africa here, where up to 40% dependence on wheat is a real issue, that will require a lot of adjustment. But I think we should manage this foreboding with the hope and expectations that we can get out of it. Not alone, working together, and also those who have goodwill in the international community. It's very, very important. I tell you, at the beginning of COVID, I was one of the special envoys put in place by the chair of the AU at the time. There was another foreboding that COVID will be a disaster for Africa. It has set us back enormously, economically. But the rate of mortality has been lower than what was expected, despite our weak health systems. In fact, in some areas, we have done much better than many rich countries. Africa's Center for Disease Control has been an exemplar across the world, like your bank has been in terms of coming forward with solutions early on. So, the times are tough. It's a perfect storm. But we need to come out of here with the confidence that if we do the right things, both the short term and the medium term, we can come out of this crisis.
We'll end there. Dr. Donald Kabaruka, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Southbridge Group. Thank you so much for joining me. And former President of the African Development Bank. Thank you very much. We end on that hopeful note, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bronwyn Nielsen, for concluding the first day of these 29th meetings of Afreximbank. That's it. You're free now to go. We have to vacate this building very quickly before 7 p.m. So please don't mingle. Take yourselves outside, and we will see you back here before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Before 9 o'clock. Remember to get your antigen, your COVID tests. Don't forget your COVID tests, because you won't be let in. Thank you. It's been wonderful. See you tomorrow.